So I figured I'd cover liberalism today, why it fails, how it's related to things like middle out thinking, how it flattens the world, and why all of that is important. So I think the easiest way to understand the idea of liberalism is to say that it is an individualistic perspective that starts from the individual and then works its way out from there. Okay, so all things in liberalism are stated with respect to the individual in the center, and everything else is apart from that, in essence. But that makes the individual the starting point. Now, I've said this in other places. I don't know if I've said this in well, say my recorded videos. There's no such thing as an individual. There are persons, and persons are connected to themselves, other persons, and nature at a minimum. That's just the way the world is. It's relational, and therefore person doesn't exist unconnected from itself, other persons, and nature. And that's why there's no such thing as an individual, because you can't define individual that way. Individual is a scientific dissection, meaning apart. And so while it may be useful to talk about an individual blade of grass, there is no such thing as an individual blade of grass, because grass is already plural, by the way. That's weird, isn't it? Sort of indicates that you can't have just one of them. But the more important reason is because you can't grow a single blade of grass. It doesn't work. One may appear first, or one may be last, but it will not persist. And that's the interesting part, is that the idea of the individual does not persist. So it may be feasible in certain perspectives for short periods of time, much like something out of a super collider, but ultimately it's not going to last. Right? It can't sustain. Now, when you start from the individual and look outwards, you can easily, in fact, I would argue you kind of have to posit that individuals, by definition, would be free from all constraints and free to act in any way they want. That's actually kind of axiomatic if you start from the idea of individual. You're not going to get around those two conclusions because you've separated yourself from the world, right? You've removed relation. And well, if you've removed relation, you've removed constraint. And if you've removed constraint, then why can't you do whatever you want? So you can see the freedom to, and the freedom from is, well, we've removed relation, so there's no consequence. Because relation doesn't exist. And with the individual, you've already designated the individual as a part. It's an apartness designation. It's a dissection of a person away from relation. You've dissected the relation, cut that away, and left whatever was there without the relation. Unfortunately, there is nothing there without the relation. And the thing is, and just as with the blade of grass, individual doesn't just pop out of nowhere. The blade of grass is growing in the ground. There's a sun above. There's water. All of these things combine to make the blade of grass happen. The blade of grass is inherently relational to other blades of grass, among other things. And so it is with persons. Persons are inherently relational. They don't exist outside of their relation. Why? Because the so-called individual started inside a creation. The beginning is not the individual and then looking outwards. The beginning is the creation, and then the individual comes into existence inside of that. And because it's inside, already axiomatically defined, it's contained and therefore constrained in some way. Now it is also connected because everything in the creation is connected. You can think of it any number of ways. There's lots of good theological ways to think about that. And there's lots of good philosophical ways to think about that, if indeed philosophy exists. There's lots of scientific ways to think about that. There's just lots of ways to consider how things are related in the world and the fact that that kind of matters. So when you're talking about liberalism, you're talking about this individualism because individuals are at the center. All the reasoning is done from that perspective, which is a convenient perspective for us. It's convenient for a number of reasons, right? It's not inherently narcissistic, but it leads to narcissism. It's inherently lazy, is what it is. Simple observation of the world will allow you to posit everything in relation to yourself. You can then abstract yourself to individual as a concept. Not that I recommend you do that, obviously, because individuals don't exist, but you can do that. And that makes it very easy to think about the world and very easy for your ego to believe that it knows way more about the world than it does. Because you're just looking around, you see how things work, seems to work that way, problem solved. Not an issue. But that's not what's happening. And so liberalism doesn't have a highest aside from the individual. That's sort of like where that's at. And because you can see that, you can experience that, like all of your experience is apparently the individual experience, at least to you, you're in the center and you don't need to move. The world needs to move because it's in the way of your individual preferences, your individual perspective, your individual ability. So the world needs to change. Now, liberalism doesn't lead to this conclusion, we'll say immediately most times, but it has to go there. It doesn't have any other place to go because you've started with the individual at the start, at the center, as the highest thing. You should always start from the highest point. It's just not the individual person. That's not the highest point. That's not the place to start. And that's the problem. That's the problem that this has. And so because we begin as a created being within a creation, which is not a being per se, but all the things around us, as well as other beings, so don't get confused, then that changes the game. One individual, for example, cannot create another individual. That doesn't make any sense. Biologically, what happens is it takes two. Sorry, it just does. And you can say, well, it doesn't take two for all creatures. And I'm like, well, maybe, maybe not. Are you sure? Are you sure you know how that works? It certainly takes two things. It still takes a place to have a birth and a birth. So there's not one thing there. Like there's no point at which there's one thing. And that begs the question, well, what things should take primacy? Liberalism doesn't have a way of speaking about what should take primacy because the individual is the only object, prime object. That's it. Everything else is stated from there in relation to. And so aside from the problems I've already mentioned with liberalism, it's also going to lead eventually, but inevitably, to this confusion around judgment. Clearly, in order to act in the world, you need to judge. Action doesn't make any sense outside of judgment. And if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice, to quote Rush. Therefore, judgment is already happening when you're taking actions in the world. So the judgment has to have been with the individual. And therefore, all of the priorities have to be from the perspective of the individual. But the priorities of the world are not that way. Even in evolution, the priority is with the species and not with any member of the species. In fact, quite the opposite. And so that model for the world doesn't actually work. It doesn't work. And all these side effects appear as the result of positing liberalism. It's purely based on individualism. It doesn't have another frame because you'd have to start somewhere else. And it's very hard for you to start from someone else or a group of people because you're not a group of people. The best you can be is part of a group of people, but that's only part. You can't see the whole because you're the part. These things get very difficult. Now you can observe a group from the outside, but then you don't understand the group dynamics because you can only understand the group dynamics if you're inside. But this flattening of the world, this inevitable equality that happens as the result of liberalism, there's no way around it. The liberal thesis is flawed fundamentally such that it cannot be recovered. And that's unfortunate because it's better to have ways of understanding the world that are accessible to you. The allure of liberalism in terms of your ego is unbelievably hard to overcome. And that's why you'll see so many liberals fighting right now, right? They're fighting over, well, you're a good liberal, you're a bad liberal, this is liberalism, but I'm not a liberal. It's like, okay, I hear that you're not a liberal all of a sudden, although you were yesterday. What are you now? And they don't have a what are you now. They're just denying liberalism because they see its failure. But they've run away from something and they haven't run towards something. That's always a problem because you're more likely to run into trouble than you are to run into truth, goodness, and beauty. That's worth noting. And so when we engage with liberalism, we engage with a fundamentally egoic, fundamentally individualistic, fundamentally equal, and fundamentally judgmental, and fundamentally flawed system that cannot map to the world that we live in. Because fundamentally, we were born persons in relation to a bunch of other things. And so the core assumption is fundamentally incorrect. And it cannot be redeemed. It cannot be fixed. It has to be destroyed and rethought of. Now, unfortunately, the best way for you to understand the world is to focus on the parts that you can understand the best, that work the best for you, and then listen to a bunch of people who maybe are older than you or are passing down information, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, from the past about how things work out, we'll say over the time span of a lifetime, or maybe multiple lifetimes, which you don't have access to directly because you're only going to have one life. And by the time you get there, it's kind of too late. Like, oh, I made this bad decision when I was 12 and now I'm screwed. Right. That happens. That happens all the time to people. You just look around and see it. Oh, I made a bad decision. I started taking drugs and that affected the rest of my... Oh, yes. Yes, it did. Yes, it did. In ways you cannot imagine. And that's the problem. We think we can make up for it with imagination, with abstraction, but you can't. And it's not that imagination and abstraction aren't useful answers. You can think of all mythology and all fairy tales as abstractions. Analogy, abstraction. Metaphor, abstraction. These are all useful tools. The question is, which abstractions are you engaged with and where are they from? If they're not older than you, that's already a problem. If they're older than you, but they haven't been, we'll say, used consistently for thousands of years, that's a problem. But you should acquiesce to some of these things because you're a tiny person in the world. You've got one life to live. You're going to screw it up if you don't listen to the wisdom of the past. And discerning the wisdom of the past is not easy, but there are skills that you can employ to do that. And some of them are inherent in things like fairy tales and metaphors and analogies and myths. That's what they're for. This is why when Jordan Peterson says it's more true than true, there you go. Or it's more true than scientific correspondence to the material reality truth, which is more what he's talking about, I think, because it's true in the abstract. That is correct. It's true in the abstract, right? Abstractions are hard. If they don't link back to sort of real world grounded events, they're not terribly useful. And so you kind of have to be aware. Also, can't do without abstraction because we need analogies, we need metaphors, we need parables, we need fairy tales, we need myths, we need all these things. They're not optional. You're not getting around them. No one ever has. You think you're the first generation to try, or the past 50 or 70 years is the first time anybody tried? I don't think so somehow. I got my questions if that's what you think. So liberalism is effectively a closed world equality doctrine, whether it intends to be or not, that fails to map to the world in a useful way across time. Again, it's attractive because you can do it yourself. You can derive all of liberalism in your head from your own personal experience for the most part. So that's pretty attractive because it reinforces itself, right? Aha, I'm an individual. I can understand the world using a simple formula and I don't need anyone's help. But the world is much bigger than liberalism understands or can understand. And having a proper understanding of where the person exists in the hierarchy of being within nature is what fights domicide. Individualism, liberalism, creates domicide by design. There's no way around. You can't fix that. It's baked in. It's built in. It's inevitable. It's not a problem to be solved because it can't be solved, and therefore it's not a problem. It's a side effect of starting in the wrong place. The right place to start is higher up the hierarchy. Now, that may be a tricky problem to resolve, but ultimately we already have those answers. You may not like those answers. Those answers may not have the level of perfection or precision and accuracy that you've come to expect from your video game reality or from your belief in science or something. But those answers are available. We typically call them religion. They're very well studied. You will not catch up at any point in your life to the amount of study that's already been done in any of the religions that are more than you old. So don't try. The proper attitude is to submit yourself as a person in the correct position in the hierarchy so that you can get along with others better. Individualism, this liberalism, you're not going to get along with others better. You may be able to find a way to get along with people, but it will be very devoid of depth. It will be very shallow. It will be very flat. Liberalism is very much a flattening of the world. And that's why I appreciate you engaging here, because I'm trying to re-enchant the world, to give it depth again. And the only way I can do that is if you give me the thing that I value the most, which is your time and attention.